In the last few weeks, we've been looking at all aspects of image design, and we started this session at the beginning of the year talking about what makes an engaging image and distilling those aspects of when you love an image, why do you love it? What is it about it that makes it engaging? And we talked about three essential things, and one was the timing of when the image was actually taken. What did it capture in terms of spontaneity? The other was the aesthetics and what makes it visually pleasing. Why do you just love to look at it? And the other is what makes it intriguing, and that's the narrative. And so we've been talking about all the things that we can do as photographers to ensure that what we end up capturing is engaging, because usually what we pick up the camera to take is engaging in the first place because we decided to press the button and we thought it was worth capturing. And it's for that very reason we want to make sure that in our image we capture all of the aspects that captured our imagination in the first place. And we want to know psychologically what triggered us to do that, because what makes an image engaging is psychology. It's what grabs us. And so what I've done is dissected each of the aspects of composition down. And last week we looked at shapes and all of the geometrical shapes like triangles, rectangles, circles, and the emotive aspect of each one of those shapes. And this week we're going to have a look at form, and we're going to have a look at all the aspects of form within an image that contributes both aesthetically to how pleasant the image is to look at, just from a visual perspective, and also some of the psychological aspects of that form. And so essentially the difference between shape and form is that shape tends to be two-dimensional. It's triangles and rectangles and circles and the things that we were talking about, and they tend to be aesthetically pleasing and also provide some sort of rhythm or emotional balance or stability to an image. Whereas form can be lots of different things about how that composition is actually made up. And one of the first things that we're going to look at this morning is groups, and how we psychologically see groups of things within images. Gestalt, you've probably heard about. I had heard about Gestalt theory for years, but had no idea what it was about until I started photography. And it's a psychology of how we look at something visually and psychologically process it. And one of the things that Gestalt, he has a number of laws within his Gestalt theory. And one of them is about simplification, that when we see chaos visually, we, in order to be able to process it and also remember it and come to terms with it and understand it, we simplify by grouping. And one of the things that I've said to you continually about compositional aspects of an image is simplification. The more that you can simplify an image, the more people can understand it readily and engage with it. As soon as you make something totally chaotic, they shy away from it, just like we shy away from anything that's chaotic. If you can give people patterns and rhythms and shapes and forms that they can process, then they get engaged in the image and they start processing it psychologically. And so you can see in this image on the right here, it is chaotic. It's just a whole lot of building floors and different rooms within that apartment building. But Gestalt says that what we do when we see chaos like that is we simplify it into shapes and forms. And if you stand back and have a look at that image, you see it as a series of lines and rectangles and perhaps some simple colours. You don't see the chaos. And that is a lot more calming when we aesthetically look at an image. And so when we're looking at taking an image, something that will make it more aesthetically pleasing for the user, or for the viewer, is to simplify it for them and give them the visual stimuli to see the patterns and shapes in it, and to be able to simplify the chaos. And sometimes those groupings that the viewer sees may be based on the actual objects and shapes themselves, as it was with the apartment building, or it also can be based on colours or shapes or textures, or subjects within or objects within the image that enable the viewer to group them and immediately be able to make sense of the image. And so with these two examples, you can see the obvious grouping on the left is the group of canoes, and even those canoes are grouped within colour. And so we can immediately start organising this image. There's a group of boats at the back of it, and then there's a group of clouds, so that it allows us as the viewer to be able to very simply organise this image. There's quite clear-cut colours in here as well, and it's not something that's chaotic, although really it is. It's a whole lot of different layers have been built up here, but because the layers have been grouped both by colour and by object, it allows the viewer to very easily read this image and walk around it. And so simplifying the narrative and the way that the viewer can organise the shapes and colours within an image makes it more aesthetically pleasing. The image on the right is chaotic, and it's a thorny problem. It's a cactus, and there's lots of thorns there, and that's really what is a photograph of. But you can see, because those thorns have been organised into lines, then we see the lines of thorns. We don't see the individual thorns, and we can very quickly and easily process that image. And one of the other things is that we talked about in the past was that rather than just put things vertically, it always gives a bit of energy to an image if we can just give it a bit of a diagonal. So when you're wanting to photograph something because you think it is visually engaging, try and think of all the things that we've talked about and what it means to the viewer. Now, a thorny cactus is something that has energy to it, because we know, warning, don't touch this. And so putting it on the diagonal does help with that energy in that message. We visually group similar things, and that allows us to make sense of them. So this, on the left, we've got all of these daisies. And if you look at it, the first thing that you think about is the fact that it is sort of almost visually grouped in a triangle. And you see some lines of some of the buds going down there. And it immediately allows you to make sense of this image. You don't see each of the individual flowers. You see them as a group. On the right here, we have, I'm not sure what these, I think it's made by worms or crabs or some sort of, does someone know what they are?
Yes, it's crabs.
It's crabs, right. But isn't it interesting how they make patterns that we see from above? To me, I saw this and immediately thought of a flower. And so I don't see each one of the individual little balls. I see the grouping and the structure that gives me. So when you are out there with your camera and you see things like this, then photograph them because they're intriguing. It allows the viewer to dive into it and realise this isn't a flower. This is in fact made up of all individual parts, and it gives another level of inspection into the image. The same with these trees. I saw them from a bus when we were in Croatia, and I just loved the banding. Yes, there are a whole lot of individual trees, and you don't actually see the individual trees. You just see the banding. and making horizontal stripes in the landscape. And so when we're talking about form, we're talking about individual things within our field of vision that our minds group together and make into a three-dimensional object. So when we're grouping consciously to take a photograph, we can either use these massive groupings that we've just looked at with the trees and the little crabs making the sandballs, but we can also consciously group. And if you have an opportunity to group subjects, then the best way to always group them is think about odd numbers or think about the Fibonacci numbers. Now you'll notice that most of the Fibonacci numbers, the first, how many is that? Probably 8 of them. Most of them are odd numbers, and it's because odd numbers are more visually interesting. They're a bit off-putting, odd numbers. You know, we like things to be symmetrical and even and whatever, but when we see odd numbers, we immediately get engaged. And at the end of the day, how good an image is based on how long someone looks at it and is interested by it. So if you are looking at creating a still life or photographing a series of objects like I did with the canoes, an odd number, and ideally if it's a Fibonacci number, will make that image more intriguing. So it's just a matter of how you frame the image, of how many you include. If you include 4, it just becomes a bit ho-hum. If you only include 3 in your framing, then it's a lot more interesting, or if you include 5. And 3 and 5 are always a lot more interesting than if you include 1. But 1, as we'll see when we look at negative space, is often intriguing in itself. So that's just a clue when you have got a number of things lined up of how many to include in your image. In the first one, I've got an even number, but it's a Fibonacci number. And pairs are always really interesting. And we flip from one to the other visually. It helps that they're red as well. This one on the right, I saw this at a country cafe. I walked out the back to go to the bathroom, and I saw these 3 chairs lined up, and I just really love this image. I had to go back and get my camera and take it. Still don't know why I love it. I don't know whether it's the colours and the complementary colours of the warm and the cool, but these 3 chairs just look like they were waiting for someone. And I don't think it would have worked with 4, and I don't think it would have worked with 2. It just needed those 3. And the same thing, if you're intrigued by something, I really love the way these ropes on the boat were so carefully tied. It's much more interesting if you can pick up 3 in your frame. And with these chair lifts, picking up 5 in the frame gives it a rhythm and makes it more interesting and intriguing. So just remember that odd numbers make better images. So in these with the buildings and picking up the verticals in the buildings, try and pick up some odd numbers. And I'm not sure whether this is 3 or 9 things. If you look at it from a column perspective, it's 3, but individually it's actually 9. And it makes your eye bounce around the image and gives it a level of interest. So that's one aspect of form, is to look at grouping. And if you do see patterns within groups, try and optimize those patterns within those groups. And if you do get an opportunity to photograph several things, try and make those several things an odd number or make them a Fibonacci number. So the next thing we're going to have a look at in form is negative space. And negative space helps us break some of those compositional rules that we learned, of rules of thirds and how we place things around the frame and what we allow to be at the edge of frame and what we try and keep away from the edge of frame, etc. But negative space is usually very much about simplicity. And it emphasizes the subject, eliminating the distractions, and it usually involves allowing a lot of space around the subject. Now, that space doesn't need to be empty. It just needs to be supportive, but not distracting. So we can look at simple images which use a lot of negative space. And you can see with this one on the left here, with the Strzelecea, all of those fanning of the bird of paradise feathers point to the rest of the image and point outwards, but I've left lots of space around to allow you to go somewhere within it. And the one on the right, the web from the spider that's called the damselfly, provides context, but it doesn't detract from the main image. And so negative space is always about less is more, and we've talked about the elegance of images and the simplicity of images, and often some of the best images are very, very simple. And so both of these images, there's not much in them, but it's just about their simplicity. And whenever you're photographing, photography is about reduction and remove until you get to the essential components of what you're trying to take. Because otherwise you'll find often when I critique your images, I'll say, lose the bit on the right. It's not contributing to the story. And always look around the frame when you're taking it. If it's not contributing to the story, get rid of it. If it's providing context, then leave it in. But don't allow anything in that background to detract from the main story. Ensure that it supports it and doesn't detract from it. And so even with this negative space, it's all about the rice worker in Vietnam planting rice, but the rest of the scene hasn't got a lot of distractions in it and just provides context for it. So the next aspect of shape and form, and we're looking at form specifically at the moment, is the concept of abstract images. And abstract images tend to confuse rather than clarify. And most of what we've been talking about to date for our composition is to simplify and clarify the narrative for the viewer. Whereas abstract just turns that upside down on its head and says, we're not going to simplify this narrative for you. We're going to make you work for it, and we're going to intrigue you and suck you into the image to try and work out what it is and why it is that you like it. And there's lots of different techniques that you can do to create an abstract image, and we're just going to have a look at some of the techniques that you can employ to make that image abstract. And I really encourage you next time we're out at a workshop to try and look at the world in an abstract way. And it must have been a really interesting time in art when people moved away from recording things that were exactly documentary of what the world looked like to move into abstract. And it's interesting that at that time is when photography came into its strengths, because photography could now document the world a lot better than what the artists could. So what it did is give the artists freedom to try to look at the world another way. And we can do the same with photography, because I just feel that working with light and painting with light is just another form, an art form. And so we just use the camera in more innovative ways to paint with light to create abstract form. So position can create an abstract, just the way that you use the frame around an image and how you take that image can confuse and intrigue and make the viewer investigate the image based on shapes and colours and make them wonder what it is. This one on the right it's quite intriguing, and all it was looking straight up at a light post. And so these two things on the right are just lights at the top of the light post, and those things in the background are just the fairy lights that they show at night against a blue sky. But it's quite an intriguing image just because of the position that was actually taken. And you can also use your camera and wide angle lenses to give you distortion and perspective, and make the image a geometric abstract in itself when you're just photographing the real world. Use light. This is a light field and dark field technique of taking images, where you just use the light to provide you with the shapes, and it's just a photographic technique that you can employ to take advantage of reflections and the characteristics of glass. The one up the top there is just a lighthouse. It's just taking the globe in a lighthouse, and it isn't a diptych. It's just taking the globe as it was in a lighthouse. But you could see the colours and the shapes, and it was intriguing. And the one down below is just some apartment buildings. You can use movement, and this is a technique called intentional camera movement. And one day we'll just do a class in it, and you can have a practice at it. But what it really involves is just lowering the speed in your camera and reducing the amount of light that can get in using your aperture and ISO, and then just moving your camera. And the one on the left here is just some bushes, and moving the camera, just wiggling it, and it gives us some lovely light and shape. And the one on the right, I'm just trying to think what that was. It was something fairly ordinary. It looks like a beach scene, but it wasn't. And the other is just the point of view or crop that you use can make something quite intriguing. This one up here on the left is the Freedom Tower in Tehran, and it's looking straight up at it. But it's a building, it's a tower, but it doesn't look like it. It's hard to work out what it is based on the perspective that we've used, the point of view and the crop. And the same at the right here, it's sort of what is it, and it allows you to dive into it and finally work out that it's in fact a detailed view of a flower. And this has used light as well. So by darkening and only using a pinpoint light into the centre of the flower, we've abstracted it via that. We've abstracted it by the point of view, and we've abstracted it by the crop. So all of these techniques can be used at once, but they intrigue. It's just an iris, but it's an intriguing view of an iris. And the more that we can intrigue the viewer, the more engaging the image is. The other thing is that we can use is just focus. And these are just some dogwood, just photographed outside using natural light, but just employing the capability of putting them out of focus. And so using your camera as a tool to create your abstracts. And I read once that some of the Impressionists, they think that they started their Impressionism painting because they got really bad cataracts. And the more I get cataracts, the more I think that that's exactly where it came from. There is also the concept, it's called pareidolia. I've never heard it actually spoken about, but I knew there was a word for it. And it's when you see things in the real world that look like something else. And it's commonly done with clouds. People look up at a cloud and they see a shape of something. And often in the sand, in shapes like we saw before with the crab sandballs turned into a flower just by the mere shape of them, we see something else in something that is not meant to be. This one on the left is just where I cut off a branch on one of my silver birches, and it struck me like an angelfish, so I photographed it. And the one on the right I just called Tree Hugger, because it just struck me like a young girl hugging a tree. So again, this is sort of interest and intrigue, just adding something to your abstract that it looks like something else and people get intrigued by it. So what I want you to do this week is to think about ways that you can photograph groups of things, that they can be simplified within the image. Think about how many items you actually put in a group, and have a play around with abstract. And how can you just crop, and with light and with perspective and with focus, make something that everybody knows what it is, but by making it abstract, you've now produced an intriguing image. So that's your homework for this week, and thank you.